We know that her name is Elia. We know that her name is Abby. We know that her name is Abir. We know that her name is Ada. We know that her name is Ada. Second option, segunda opción. We know that her name is Adan. We know that her name is Adela. We know that her name is Adriana. We know that her name is Agatha. We know that her name is Anit. We know that her name is Anit. Muy difícil, tomo una pausa. We know that her name is... We know that her name is Agnieszka. We know that her name is Ida. We know that her name is Aide. We know that her name is Aisha. We know that her name is Alejandra. We know that her name is Alessia. We know that her name is Alexa. We know that her name is Alexandra. We know that her name is Alexia. We know that her name is Alice. We know that her name is Alicia. We know that her name is Alina. We know that her name is Alison. We know that her name is Alma. We know that her name is Alisa. We know that her name is Amal. We know that her name is Amalia. We know that her name is Amelie. We know that her name is Amanda. We know that her name is Amalia. We know that her name is Amelie. We know that her name is Amanda. We know that her name is Amaya. We know that her name is Amelia. We know that her name is Amelie. We know that her name is Amy. We know that her name is Anna. We know that her name is Annabelle. We know that her name is Anna Maria. We know that her name is Anastasia. We know that her name is Anastasia. We know that her name is Angela. We know that her name is Angelica. We know that her name is Angelina. We know that her name is Anaya. Alternativo. We know that her name is Ania. We know that her name is Anita. We know that her name is Anne. We know that her name is Annie. Creo que los dos se pronuncian Annie y Anne, aunque se escriben diferente, pero te he dicho las dos formas. We know that her name is Anika. We know that her name is Antonia. We know that her name is Anwar. We know that her name is Aranzazu. We know that her name is Aranthathu. Con Z y con Z, dependiendo Sudamérica o España, por si acaso. We know that her name is Ariana. We know that her name is Aroa. We know that her name is Audrey. We know that her name is Aurea. Alternativo. We know that her name is Aurea. We know that her name is Aya. We know that her name is Barbara. We know that her name is Beatrice. We know that her name is Beatriz. Con Z y Z. We know that her name is Beatrice. We know that her name is Beatriz. Te he hecho unas variaciones. We know that her name is Bella. We know that her name is Bella. Si es inglesa o española, no lo sé. We know that her name is Berta. We know that her name is Bianca. We know that her name is Blanca. We know that her name is Brenda. We know that her name is Brianna. We know that her name is Camilla. We know that her name is Camille. We know that her name is Carrie. We know that her name is Carla. We know that her name is Carly. We know that her name is Carlotta. We know that her name is Carmen. We know that her name is Carol. We know that her name is Carolina. We know that her name is Caroline. We know that her name is Cassandra. We know that her name is Catalina. We know that her name is Cataline. We know that her name is Catherine. We know that her name is Cecilia. We know that her name is Cecilia. Pardon? We know that her name is Cecilia. Así, S y Z dependiendo si es sudamericana, inglesa o española. Te doy las dos opciones. We know that her name is Celia. We know that her name is Celia. We know that her name is Celine. We know that her name is Chantal. We know that her name is Charlotte. We know that her name is Chiara. We know that her name is Chloe. We know that her name is Chloe. Dos variantes. We know that her name is John. We know that her name is Christine. We know that her name is Cindy. We know that her name is Cynthia. We know that her name is We know that her name is Cynthia. We know that her name is Cynthia. Por si acaso que es española. We know that her name is Cynthia. 87. We know that her name is Clara. We know that her name is Claire. We know that her name is Claudia. We know that her name is Constantina. We know that her name is Constanza. Variante. We know that her name is Constanza. We know that her name is Consuelo. We know that her name is Corina. We know that her name is Christina. We know that her name is Damaris. We know that her name is Daniela. We know that her name is Dana. We know that her name is Dana. Segunda opción. We know that her name is Daria. We know that her name is Daria. Segunda opción. We know that her name is Dawn. We know that her name is Deborah. Esto está en inglés. We know that her name is Deborah. Si es sudamericana. We know that her name is Denise. Si es inglesa. We know that her name is Denise. Si es sudamericana. We know that her name is Diane. Esto es si es inglesa. We know that her name is Diane. Si es sudamericana. We know that her name is Diana. Si es inglesa. We know that her name is Diana. Si es sudamericana. We know that her name is Dina. We know that her name is Dolores. We know that her name is Dominica. We know that her name is Donna. We know that her name is Dora. We know that her name is Doris. We know that her name is Adine. Segunda opción, si es sudamericana. We know that her name is Edine. We know that her name is Edith. We know that her name is Edurne. We know that her name is Eileen. We know that her name is Ekaterina. We know that her name is Elena. We know that her name is Eleni. We know that her name is Elisa. We know that her name is Elizabeth. Y si es española, we know that her name is Elizabeth. We know that her name is Ella. We know that her name is Elodie. We know that her name is Elsa. We know that her name is Elvira. We know that her name is Emily. We know that her name is Emilia. We know that her name is Emily. Y voy a volver a 123 con un poco más de E y menos de I. 123 otra vez. We know that her name is Emily. Es un variante. 124. We know that her name is Emilia. We know that her name is Emily. We know that her name is Emma. We know that her name is Erica. We know that her name is Erin. Otra vez. We know that her name is Erin. We know that her name is Esha. ¿Puedo hacer un variante? We know that her name is Isha. We know that her name is Estefania. We know that her name is Estella. We know that her name is Esther. Y con T en vez de TH. We know that her name is Esther. We know that her name is Eva. Y más español. We know that her name is Eba. We know that her name is Evangelia. Y más español. We know that her name is Evangelia. We know that her name is Evelyn. Y más español. We know that her name is Evelyn. We know that her name is Fabiola. We know that her name is Fatima. We know that her name is Fatima. We know that her name is Federica. We know that her name is Felicia. Y más inglés. We know that her name is Felicia. We know that her name is Fernanda. Ya he llegado a 141 y voy a seguir en una segunda toma, ¿vale?